On the morning of the 26th of May, 1940, an order was transmitted from the Admiralty building in London to a secret naval headquarters in Dover.
That he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him...
The new Prime Minister had reason to thank the men of Dunkirk for their heroism. For days they faced terrible danger as the German Luftwaffe attacked troops in Dunkirk and on the beaches. What Sid and others knew was that aside from the heroics, there was another story to be told about Dunkirk and the events leading up to the evacuation. But this was swept aside, as there was a need in Britain to make Dunkirk into something more positive for the struggle ahead.
All the might of the German Air Force failed to stop them. We beat them back. We got our armies away.
So myths were established, necessary myths, the half-truths of propaganda. But to understand Dunkirk fully, you have to see a bigger picture with a European dimension beyond the evacuation itself. Dunkirk came after a period of military disaster, a sequence of events which saw a surprise attack by the Germans and their rapid advance through France in a breathtaking period of blitzkrieg. Then, a chaotic retreat to the coast by Allied troops, evacuation followed by the fall of France. For the French, the shame of defeat demanded blame and scapegoats. So again, myths, this time of betrayal, were created to explain away national disaster. For Germany, victory created a different kind of myth, providing Hitler with an image of himself as military genius and triumphant propaganda to persuade Germans that anything was now possible. So because myth, misconception and misunderstanding, then and now, have complicated our understanding of this critical episode in the Second World War, it's important to return to Dunkirk and ask other questions of this extraordinary story. Our misconceptions start at the beginning of the crisis which led to Dunkirk, when on the 10th of May 1940, German Army Group B invaded neutral Belgium, Holland and Luxembourg. It's been believed that the Allied troops who raced to confront the Germans somehow lacked motivation. But the mood was good after the months of waiting during the phony war.
The government was telling us we had nothing to worry about, that everything would be fine, that we were sure to win. So what's there to worry about when you're told you're the stronger? We went happily into battle.
On the 10th of May 1940, nobody on the Allied side was expecting to be defeated. Morale was high. Some of the best French forces and the British Army headed into Belgium, confident that they could link up with Belgian forces and establish defensive lines that would hold and stop the German advance somewhere in central Belgium, just as in western Belgium the Germans had been stopped in 1914.
Side's commander in the field was General Gort, leading a British expeditionary force which numbered 400,000 men in May 1940. Both the British and the French were confident that with their resources at home and their empires abroad, they could win a war with Germany.
In the spring of 1940, French factories and British factories were producing more materials for war than German factories. And as a result, as the months went by, the English and French forces were in the process of gaining an advantage.
But after Dunkirk, it was convenient to fall back on the myth of German superiority. They were simply bigger and better. Yet in May 1940, there was an approximate parity of forces. The Allies had 136 divisions, Germans 135. The Nazis, of course, were keen to promote this myth of superiority and build up the image of the German fighting man.
Hitler and the Nazis always talked in terms of the best race. This was applied to the army. They had to be the best troops. These were, of course, fanciful ideas derived from the madness of their racial ideology. The propaganda could always say after one single victorious campaign, didn't we predict this? That the German race is the best, that German soldiers are the best.
And of all the cogs in the German military machine, propaganda paid special attention to the tanks, the panzers. But French newsreels also like to dwell on images of their tanks. And it is now considered that French tanks were almost superior to the German panzers.
One can say that when it came to tanks, the French and Germans were virtually equal, both in terms of quality and quantity. There were just as many French tanks as there were German tanks. And as far as quality was concerned, the French tanks were just as good as the Germans. And in some cases, the French tanks were superior, particularly in terms of their armor, compared to the Germans. But what made all the difference was the method of deployment.
The German invasion was two-pronged, with a second assault group assembling in Germany, Army Group A. 134,000 troops and 7 panzer divisions with 1,222 tanks clogged up German roads, creating a vast traffic jam. This was a clumsy operation, a bad start, providing a sitting target missed by the Allied air forces. The Germans could have been stopped. Nothing was inevitable about the crisis before Dunkirk.
Ich kann mich gut an den Verkehrsstau erinnern.
I can remember the traffic jam very well. It was like one endless military worm. We had to overtake to get to our troop, And this we could do because we had priority. But when we left the borders of the Reich, the traffic jam eased off because different groups went on different but parallel roads heading in the same direction.
At Koblenz, the headquarters of Army Group A on the Rhine, what was now being put into operation was the Manstein Plan, an audacious invasion of France from the east. Early in 1940, Group Chief of Staff General Manstein had advocated this strategy. Given the code name of Sichelschnitt, the Scythe, this plan would see the Germans cut through the forests of the Ardennes in Belgium and Luxembourg and into France. Tanks and other motorized units would then move quickly towards the French coast, isolating Allied forces as Army Group B moved south. Although considered a gamble with high stakes, Hitler himself had considered such a strategy and was keen to see his instincts vindicated. Also backing the plan was the Chief of General Staff, Halder, a firm believer in this new kind of warfare, blitzkrieg. Army Group A moved through the Ardennes without opposition.
The scenery was very nice, and we were very well camouflaged. It was very wooded, so we were hard to detect from the air. We were quite safe from the air reconnaissance of the enemy in the Ardennes because of the nature of this area. General von Kleist has announced we wouldn't get any sleep for 3 nights, but in reality we didn't get any proper sleep for 5 or 6 nights. But this didn't matter. The operation was on track and everybody was giving his best.
On the River Meuse, near the French town of Sedan, divisions of the French 2nd and 9th Army waited. Because French intelligence predicted that the main thrust of the German invasion wouldn't come here, these French troops were older reservists, poorly trained and equipped, badly led. At 7 o'clock in the morning of the 13th of May, an 8-hour attack on French positions began. 1,000 planes, including Stuka dive bombers.
They came in swarms, tipping onto their left wings. As they went down, they switched on a siren, a howling siren which had a great effect on the morale of the enemy. They targeted a bunker or a pocket of resistance, dropped their bombs, then went up again. It sounded like this.
Then, in the afternoon of the 13th, the Meuse was crossed at 3 points by German commando units. These allowed bridgeheads to be established for panzer divisions to cross. When news of the German crossing reached the French High Command, there was still confidence in the possibility of a counter-offensive at Sedan. There was still no sense that a fatal blunder had been made in this decisive sector.
Si les Allemands attaquent par les Ardennes,
if the Germans attack through the Ardennes and manage to get through, we would be waiting for them on the other side. That meant, quite simply, that if this happened, the Germans would be taking a perilous risk, and one that would cost them enormously. This was because they would be walking straight into a trap.
But there was no trap for the advancing Germans. For a time, some French units did hold back the Germans. But south of Sedan, rumors of an advance towards the village of Bousson created a panic where 20,000 troops fled. After 3 days and nights of fighting, tired German troops might have thought that this was the time to rest and recuperate. But one panzer commander, General Heinz Guderian, had other ideas.
Guderian, he was a daredevil. He improvised. And he was impulsive. He was also quick to anger. But somehow this was necessary, as he was like a lone voice trying to push a vision which often seemed to be an illusion to many others.
First breakout, other panzer commanders raced ahead. In 2 days, General Reinhardt's 6th and 8th divisions covered over 150 kilometers. Erwin Rommel of the 7th Panzer Division, like other panzer commanders, led from the front, commanding respect from his soldiers.
We were told we have to finish this war as soon as possible. And this is what Rommel tried to do. Rommel was our commander. He was brave. He wasn't a coward. When he said we had to go somewhere, he went as well. He didn't say, go ahead and check out what's going on. No, he came with us. This was typical of Rommel, and this is what he became famous for.
What became clear was that this kind of blitzkrieg, on the hoof, riding its luck, was effective. The panzers kept moving towards the vital French seaports, Dieppe, Calais, and Dunkirk. By this time, Army Group B, in a pincer movement, was pushing Allied troops back from positions in Belgium towards the French border. Ordinary soldiers sensed something was going very wrong.
What really made us downhearted was the moment when we realized that the government, that General Gamelin had so misunderstood the German strategy.
As the crisis leading to Dunkirk escalated, so came a breakdown in communications. On the 15th of May, the French High Command instructed the rest of the army to move back into France. There was a delay in this news reaching the British. French units couldn't even speak to each other.
We had no information, but contact between each other was very difficult anyway, because we had no radio. We still only had telephone lines, which had to be installed, and it would only take one bombardment to cut the line. We were effectively in the dark.
With the fighting came a civilian exodus of up to 6 million.
Thought to myself, what if you had to leave your house and farm and didn't know when you would return, and it ended up looking like this? This had an effect on me. C'est la guerre, as the French would say. This was war. But the sadness was if someone returned later and saw his house destroyed. What must this person be thinking? He must be really angry with the Germans.
In the gardens of the Quai d'Orsay, he saw documents being burnt on the well-manicured lawns. Typically, Churchill was upbeat, saying of the German advance from the Ardennes that the tortoise has protruded its head. German tanks reached the French coast at the mouth of the Somme.
The German generals were completely surprised about this success. Nobody had expected this, not even the biggest optimist. And if you read what they wrote at the time, one word appears again and again: miracle.
In London, it was decided that Chief of General Staff Ironside should travel immediately to France to meet with Gort, who had sent back a revealing request.
One could date precisely, I think, the time when the British High Command became really worried at this prospect of being literally encircled and taken prisoner and really taken out of the war. On May the 19th, that is 9 days after the German attack began, Lord Gort, the British Commander-in-Chief, sent his personal kit home, which is a pretty bad sign. And on that day, his Chief of Staff contacted the War Office to say that they might have to retreat. Obviously, he couldn't say that they would, but would the British War Office and the Admiralty particularly begin to think about this and begin to organise ships in the Channel?
At Dover Castle, looking out to the French coast, naval staff began to plan for the evacuation of British troops. At French High Command, there was a change of leadership and talk of a change in strategy.
There was a possibility, an altogether realistic one, that the armed forces that were still in the north, that is to say in Belgium and the north of France, and those that were in the south, could coordinate an attack on the Germans and have them at their mercy.
By now, French army morale was dropping. Its commander-in-chief, General Gamelin, drafted a report which seemed to blame everybody but himself. On the 19th of May, he was sacked and replaced by his arch-rival, General Maxime Weygand. Weygand now proposed a counter-offensive from the north and the south, which would attack the German corridor, now extending from the Ardennes to the Channel. On the British side, pragmatic decisions would now be made on the simple geopolitical fact that as an island nation, Britain could withdraw from the continent, protected by the sea. But France did not have that luxury, and with every military setback, tensions rose as traditional distrust of perfidious Albion began to undermine the possibility of a fight back.
Tensions can be brushed under the carpet, typically in an alliance, as long as things are going well. But once things go badly, then a lot of the old prejudices resurface, and I think that's what we see in 1940.
As Weygand's plan for a counter-offensive was being discussed, British troops confronted Rommel's 7th Division outside the town of Arras on the 21st of May. Hans Becker came face to face with the realities of combat.
When you are involved in combat and the banging starts around you to the right and to the left, and it's as if the human mechanism is switched off. All you can think is, watch out that nobody shoots you. Shoot first. If you don't, the other one will shoot, and then you're a goner. And you have no more feelings. You only look and think, watch out, your life is in danger, shoot. And these were my feelings until the combat was over.
But the battle only gave the Allies superiority for a few hours. Without more tanks and greater French cooperation, British troops were forced back. Gort realized that the forces at his disposal were simply not strong enough for the proposed counter-offensive. On the 25th of May, he decided to retreat further, towards Dunkirk. For some in France, this was betrayal. But historians on both sides of the Channel are now sceptical of these claims of duplicity.
There has been a controversy about whether Gort was anti-French, whether he began to pull out too soon. My own view is that he did his best to remain loyal to the alliance as long as he possibly could, and if anything, left the decision to pull out rather late, and that another commander might even have made the decision earlier.
The French were perhaps at that moment a little too optimistic. This was good because it produced a willingness to fight, but at the same time, not altogether realistic. It was in these circumstances that a little sooner than the French, the British came to the conclusion that in the end one could not, after all, escape the advance of the Germans towards the sea.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news. The King has sent a message to Lord Gort. The desperate battle on the northern front continues. The British Expeditionary Force has withdrawn intact towards the coast.
The OC, Berkham, told us that we are now going to retreat. He said, and we were going to retreat to Dunkirk. You will live on the land. You won't get any food from the army now. You've got to live on what you can find. It's every man for himself. Couldn't put a pinprick between the soldiers on the road. I mean, there's thousands. We were all making for one place, Dunkirk.
What was a little shocking was the sudden departure of the English, because they had been, in a way, role models for us. Models of discipline, preparation, and command. It was a model army, the British Army. The departure of the British Army that had been stationed with us during the whole 9 months prior to the German attack, when we saw that they were pulling out, that was shocking. That was a sign.
In the chaos of retreat, soldiers like Charlie Brown were separated from their units.
There was a red-cap sergeant just kicking up his bike. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, our unit was here." Well, he said, "They've been gone a long time." He said, "I advise you to get going." He said, "Go that way." Because he said, "I'm the last man here and I'm just leaving." He said, "Jerry's about 2 miles up the road."
In the words of Hitler's chief adjutant, the Panzer generals followed the retreating Allied armies like a pack of hunting dogs. But then, on the 24th of May, came an historic decision, a German mistake, allowing Allied troops to escape from Dunkirk. That evening, an order was received from Hitler to stop the advance with tanks of the 1st Panzer Division only 15 kilometers from Dunkirk, the port in its sights.
After we had taken Calais, we were moved towards Dunkirk and marched to Bourbourg and Gravelines. And in this area, we positioned ourselves. But we didn't get an order to attack. Our forward observers were not deployed. But we could see the coastline from where we were.
It's been suggested that Hitler wanted to allow the British to escape and use this goodwill gesture to begin peace negotiations. But this so-called Golden Bridge thesis is now dismissed by historians.
This famous Golden Bridge theory is wrong. Hitler never even toyed with the idea. He never said, I didn't want this fight with Britain, so I will offer the British a chance, let them escape by this Golden Bridge over the sea so that I can then turn myself against my real enemy, the Soviet Union. There were purely military, operational reasons which led to this error, to this order to stop the advance, which was the main reason that the English and French could escape.
During the 24th of May, Hitler had arrived at the field headquarters of Army Group A in the town of Charleville-Mézières. Here he gave the order to stop the tanks. There is an alternative theory to explain Hitler's decision that day, a crisis inside the German leadership. The panzer commanders wanted to move quickly on Dunkirk. They could see that with British and French forces being trapped by the last sweep of the scythe from the south and encirclement completed from the west, a quick victory was possible. They were backed by the Chief of Staff, General Halder, who on the 23rd of May authorized the transfer of tanks away from the cautious command of General von Rundstedt. But approval had not been sought from Adolf Hitler, who saw this as a
Hitler reacted with one of his famous outbursts of rage. The fundamental question was, who should have control over military operations in the future? Either the High Command, as in the First World War, or Hitler. This order to stop outside Dunkirk resulted in a kind of revolt, a power struggle between Hitler and the generals. Now, who would win this? I repeat again, Hitler wasn't interested in tactical, operational, strategic, political or ideological questions. He was only interested in a single question, the principle of power, the principle of leadership. Hitler won. The tanks were stopped. In one way, Hitler was the winner at Dunkirk, because he defeated his generals. But at the same time, he was the loser, because his order to halt was the one reason a big part of the Allied and especially the British forces could escape.
Stopping the advance gave the French an opportunity to organize their defenses at Dunkirk. But once Hitler had resolved the power struggle, the German advance resumed.
We had a lot of deaths. We lost comrades. We could see them all around us, dead, wounded, and our morale began dropping. But we still had courage. We were afraid, but never disarmed, if you see what I mean. We always had a desire to fight. It was incredibly sad. It was above all surprising because we hadn't been warned. Everything that happened was surprising because it was unexpected and murderous. There were bodies everywhere because of the bombings. I had two friends who were killed right next to me. It was Arcole and Prévost, two friends, who were hit by shells and killed. It was that was so terrible to see. The bodies all over the roads. What a disaster.
Contrary to later myths questioning French courage, up to, during and after Dunkirk, there was great sacrifice.
The proof is that the number of French losses during these 40 to 45 days of war Losses, which rose as high as 100,000 men, were equal to the rate of loss during the Great War, and these were particularly heavy.
Où on sait que ces pertes ont été particulièrement lourdes. Donc,
so the number of deaths shows clearly that the French, contrary to myth, fought well.
Contrairement au mythe, se sont bien battus.
One example out of many, Lille, during the days of the evacuation. Despite being cut off, 40,000 French troops held off the Germans for 3 days, fighting bravely in the industrial suburbs and streets of the city until their ammunition was exhausted. The battle further eased the pressure on the Dunkirk perimeter. The final decision to evacuate British troops was made by the War Office on the 25th of May. At 6:45 the next day, an order was transmitted from the Admiralty in London to Dover Castle that Operation Dynamo should begin. From a secret underground network under the White Cliffs of Dover, an extraordinary logistical exercise began which would last an exhausting 10 days. Naval staff working night and day. A vast armada of 871 Allied ships, naval vessels, fishing boats and barges now moved towards the French coast. By now, retreating British and French troops had begun to arrive in Dunkirk, evacuation beginning on the 27th of May. British soldiers were shocked by what they now saw.
The place was more or less in complete ruins. The only thing standing was their town hall. But everything else was just ruins. So there wasn't much to see. Completely shattered, hungry, tired. Got no interest in anything. I couldn't have cared what happened.
For Gustave Vincoyer of the French First Army, this was a bewildering experience.
I was there in Dunkirk for about 8 to 10 days. I don't know where I ate or where I slept, because it was never the same place 2 nights running.
Soldiers headed for the beaches.
Thousands of troops dug into sands, laying on the sands, sleeping on the sands as much as they could, walking about. Some were even lighting little fires, trying to cook something. So the sergeant said, put that fire out, as it was, every man for himself. It was chaotic. There was no orders or anything at all.
From the very first day, the German Luftwaffe used Stuka dive bombers to attack troops in Dunkirk and on the beaches nearby.
Je me souviens la journée du 27 mai.
I remember the day of the 27th of May. It was the biggest bombing raid over Dunkirk. The planes came over in waves of 50 to 100 every 20 minutes, from 9 in the morning until 7 in the evening, without stopping. They dropped incendiary bombs and explosives. It was these that turned the whole city into ruins. All the docks, everything was burning.
They do aerobatics for about 5 minutes. You're in a ditch, if you can find one, and you're saying to yourself, for God's sake, drop them and get it over. They come down one after the other. They had a whistle and, oh, the most frightening noise. And if anybody says he wasn't frightened when the Stukas were around, is a liar. Anybody.
Soldiers were puzzled by the apparent absence of the Royal Air Force.
Where are they? Where the hell are they? Why aren't they helping us out? This is all wrong. We're on our own. They've left us on our own. They just don't care. You know, this kind of thing. This is the attitude towards the RAF was.
Without visible evidence of dogfights overhead, it was understandable that a myth emerged that the RAF had let the men down. But the RAF with the Navy did cause significant damage to the Luftwaffe, in the process losing nearly 500 planes around Dunkirk. And there were sound reasons to conserve air power in the UK for the fight ahead.
The RAF component was withdrawn from France on the 21st of May, so they're operating entirely during Dunkirk from southern England, which limits their range and their time over the beaches. I think also that even while they were operating from southern England, they were still trying to, on the whole, attack targets further back. They were trying to halt the German advance in the belief that there were better targets than they were trying to intercept German fighters and bombers over Dunkirk itself, which obviously had all sorts of operational problems.
From the beginning of the operation to evacuate, ship owners responded to a government appeal to volunteer their celebrated little ships to help the Royal Navy. When they reached the beaches, the tide, the depth of water, and sheer numbers made evacuation difficult. Improvised solutions were now demanded.
There
were lorries and all kinds of vehicles that were all lined up, end to end, like a kind of jetty. There were two ways out, either to go on foot with water up to your chest, or to take one of the dinghies that were going back and forth from the beach to the boats. But there were very few of these.
There's little boats there, and they were ferrying to the bigger boats. Some of them capsized, the little boats, because so many were trying to clamber into them. I suppose panic, perhaps, I don't know. And they got capsized. There was every kind of boat you can mention there, trying to get the blokes off the beach. You didn't know what to think. Some of them were up to the waist in water, trying to get onto the boat. They were standing there. They couldn't get on, so they had to turn around and come back. There was others with little boats trying to row out to the bigger boats, but couldn't get through. And they had to come back. Oh no, it was really horrendous.
Because the little ships had problems relaying troops to bigger naval vessels offshore, another method of evacuation had to be found. The solution was the mole, the mile-long jetty to the right of the entrance to Dunkirk harbour. Deep water here, allowing large naval ships to dock. If there was a saviour of Dunkirk, then it was Captain William Tennant, sent by the Royal Navy to find a better way of getting troops out. Knowing the problems of beach evacuation, seeing the bombing of the port area, he thought the mole might work. There followed an operation of logistical genius, in which Tennant was an inspiring presence.
He would give us a number, and I always remember that number. It was number 10. And he said, when that number is called, you'll get your little group together and you'll make your way up the mole.
When the tide went out, it's ever so high, and the tide was out when I got there, 3 o'clock in the morning. And we got onto the mole, and then we had to wait for something to come in, and the destroyers could only get just to the end. We had to go down on rope ladder. It had been hit. We had to go back in the middle on 2 builders' planks about that wide, and if you look down, it, you know, you had vertigo.
Captain Ted said, now, you're going off the mole. I want you to run as fast as you possibly can, because the more you run, the more we can get off. And I looked round, and I was the last man. So I thought, I'm not going to get left. So I ran even faster and got to this boat. And this big sailor, it was a bit high up. I couldn't have climbed onto it. There was no steps, I think. And this big sailor seemed to lean over. He grabbed my rifle with one hand. He grabbed me in the other. He seemed to lift us straight up and dumped us on the deck.
It was as dangerous on the boats as it was on the beaches.
We weren't shattered that much that we couldn't realise what was going on, not knowing if our boat was going to be the next one to be hit. It did get hit twice, but not enough to stop it.
I sat there and I thought, what happens now? And this, well, a sailor come along. He brought me a packet of 5 Woodbines and a cup of tea. And I thought it was the first drink, decent drink I've had for days. And I drank that and I fell asleep. And they could have bombed the ship. I would have known. And the next thing I know, I was in Dover.
In the first days of the operation, many more British troops were being evacuated than French. But until the 31st of May, 6 days into the operation, there was no order to evacuate French troops from their government, afraid that this would signal capitulation and encourage defeatism. But as French soldiers waited, there was horror to be witnessed.
The worst sight was the next morning, when we would see all the dead bodies lying along the beach. The tide had brought them in. It was terribly sad. It was dangerous. But you had to take risks, and I didn't want to be a prisoner. We could see boats sinking, boats on fire. There were dead bodies floating. It was horrific.
Because of the chaos, there has never even been an estimate of the numbers killed at Dunkirk. By the 31st of May, the French government had no choice but to let its army be evacuated. Gustave Vanquoilly left for England that evening.
There were some who stayed, didn't dare go because obviously it was night. There were mines, boats were sinking. All that was a risk. Plus, we were naked under our greatcoats. But as for me, I was young. I knew how to swim. I could risk it. I'm glad I did. It turned out well.
Later, a myth
When we were given orders to change position. And sometimes we would come across British officers who would threaten us with guns, not letting us get past. That was very hard.
With the Germans closing in and the number of troops coming forward for evacuation drying up, a painful decision was made to wind up Operation Dynamo. When the last British fighting divisions left, the French commander at Dunkirk furiously declared, "Your decision dishonours Britain." The final rearguard saw the French fighting bravely, but alone.
Everything was so shocking. We just weren't used to it. But personally, I remained confident. I knew that whatever happened, I wasn't going to be evacuated, so I knew it was death or captivity.
On the 2nd of June, the last British troops left. The last French detachments went onto boats in the early hours of the 4th of June. At 9:40 that day, the 10th Corps of the 18th German Army entered Dunkirk, discovering a scene of chaos, destruction, and horror. 40,000 French troops never made it to England. Many, like Jean Coutenceau, were taken prisoner.
J'étais conscient.
I was fully aware of everything, and I was afraid. There was a real hammering in my chest.
Je peux pas vous le décrire, ça.
It's almost impossible to describe. But I didn't cry.
J'ai eu des larmes aux yeux.
I had tears in my eyes when I gave myself up,
Quand
but
je me suis rendu. Mais c'est tout. C'est tout. Je peux... Excusez-moi.
As Sid Crockett boarded a train to try and reunite with his regiment, he feared the worst.
Although we was happy to be back in England, we thought we've let England down. We've retreated. We've lost the war for them. Well, God knows what people are going to think of us now because we've come back. And we was very upset. And yet, when we passed a big factory, big building on the wall, somebody had written on this wall with whitewash probably, "Welcome home, the Dunkirk veterans." We never thought we'd see that, never. We all thought we'd be disgraced because we'd given in.
But the men of Dunkirk were now heroes, celebrated by the newsreels.
Round these men there hangs an atmosphere of glory. They're still in formation, they're still grinning, past the dust and oil on their faces. They have come back from a terrible and bitter battle, but still in their tired and half-closed eyes is mirrored the spirit and cause for which they fight. That has not gone. That can never be taken away from them.
Britain was separated from Hitler's armies by only 26 miles of water. There was an expectation that invasion could come at any time. So Churchill had to turn Dunkirk into something inspirational for the struggle ahead.
What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire.
One has to say that Churchillian rhetoric, control of the media to a considerable extent, did enable the government to impress on the people that although France had lost, although the evacuation from Dunkirk was something of a tragedy, nonetheless it wasn't the end. It was only a beginning of a long struggle which we would win. Somehow eventually we would prevail. That turned out to be true, but in ways that no one could really have predicted at the time of Dunkirk.
For France, no amount of propaganda could put a positive spin on what happened next.
For Britain, Dunkirk represented a ghastly but temporary and remediable setback on the continent of Europe. France, however, was primarily a continental power, and for France, her defeat and the whole Dunkirk evacuation of the British represented nothing short of a national catastrophe.
The day after Dunkirk fell, a second phase of Blitzkrieg began as panzers headed south. By the 14th of June, Paris was occupied. 2 days later, France had a new leader, the First World War hero of Verdun, Marshal Pétain, who quickly announced an armistice with Germany.
J'adresserai mon premier appel à la France.
In 6 weeks, France had collapsed. The search for blame, for scapegoats, began immediately. The myth of British betrayal became vital to explain defeat. Yet French historians today are sympathetic to the dilemmas faced by Britain in May 1940.
Même à Dunkerque, à ce moment-là, at Dunkirk at this time, in these extremely difficult circumstances, I think the position of the British was a wholly positive one.
Quand on regarde les choses,
looking at things objectively and retrospectively, you can say that this was the only solution. But at the time, from a French point of view, it was seen as a betrayal, as a desertion of the French.
The armistice with France became a piece of political theatre for the cameras, taking place at the site of German surrender in 1918, a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, north of Paris. What Germans called the campaign in the West merely proved to Hitler that he was invincible, the master strategist. Victory in the West became the title of a propaganda film, army film units capturing every glorious moment of the fighting. Here was proof to Germans back home that they were the master race.
Der Krieg im Westen war eine militärisch beispiellose.
The campaign in the West was a military act without precedent. This was exaggerated by German propaganda to generate mass enthusiasm for the war and for Hitler, with terrible consequences because all proportion was lost. Hitler became overconfident regarding his military leadership and thought he and the Wehrmacht were invincible.
Die Wehrmacht sich für unbesiegbar hielt.
Powerful myths shaped the story of Dunkirk. Myths fed by the demands of victory and defeat, by national stereotypes of plucky Brits, cowardly Frenchmen, and remorselessly efficient Germans. But if these myths are allowed to endure, we will continue to misunderstand Dunkirk, the moment which changed the course of the Second World War.
A taste of the way things used to be on Friday, a Christmas feast, 17th century style, complete with mince pies and spit roast beef. Tales from the Green Valley, Friday at 7:30 on 2.
Two visionaries.
This is the future.
One impossible dream.
If we can build this, we can get into space.
Whose rivalry launched mankind into the cosmos.
How many of you are confident that you'll come back alive from outer space?
The greatest adventure in history.
When do we go?
Who will win? Space Race starting soon on BBC Two.
The largest gathering of forensic experts ever are in a race against time. In these containers are the last remaining victims of the tsunami which hit Thailand on Boxing Day 2004. 4,000 bodies from 35 countries waiting to go home. The biggest global forensic operation in history. Horizon returns with Tsunami, Naming the Dead, this Thursday at 9 on BBC Two.
BBC Learning Zone from 2, but now on BBC Two, the latest headlines and comment with BBC News 24. We're joining Peter Dobby and guests for the papers.
About the settled community.